going to unpause the recording that I'd paused. So I was kind of relieved about that, because I was starting to have issues personally with some of the stuff I was being taught in yoga that was more around the esoteric side of yoga, beliefs about chakras, prana, Brahman, you know, all the other sides of yoga that I was puzzling over and not sure about, running into trouble. At that time, I had another kind of useful contact. I met a man called Peter Connolly, who's a philosopher, and he had taught comparative religions at universities for 20, 30 years. And he showed me that a lot of modern yoga, the stuff I was involved in, had a lot of inconsistencies in the theories behind it. And I spent a lot of time studying with Peter 20, 25 years ago. And we looked at all the classical texts, and he pointed out where there were inconsistencies and how we tend to look into texts to confirm our own biases. So, you know, if you have this kind of spin on life or that kind of spin on life, you can look at a text and you can draw out of it really what you want to draw out of it. And that's probably true of most ancient texts. We can seek to find whatever feels comforting for us. And you see this in Christianity and Islam and most religions as well. You'll find, you know, people who hardly believe in God who call themselves Christians, and people who believe every word of the Bible who call themselves Christians. There's a very broad church. We tend to take out of the texts what we find meaningful. And that kind of bothered me a bit as well, because it felt a bit like we were cherry picking, or I was cherry picking the bits I wanted and leaving out the bits I didn't want. And that kind of led me to a recognition that I wanted to kind of, with Vanda's basis on what do you experience when you practice, you know, what is it you actually notice in your practice about yourself, seemed a bit more honest. It seemed just very fundamental to me, that there was something undeniable about my own personal experience to myself. Right? And so I kind of started yoga again, in a sense. Then I started to explore how yoga affected me, what feelings changed when I practiced, how it affected my body. And I started to become more interested, not in anatomy, which is what I'd studied as an osteopath, but in neurology. I shifted my sense of study towards particularly the neurology of perception and sensation. And it opened up a whole new world, both osteopathically and in my yoga practice, because it's a very different world. And really, this is what I want to tease out in this first session. It shifted me from an approach where I thought structure was the most important thing, which is what it felt like when I was doing Iyengar yoga and when I was an osteopath, to in a sense, how I make sense of perception, which is where I am now. Because as we'll see, I hope, as we go through this course, perception is how we meet the world. It's not anatomy how we meet the world, it's perception. And perception, perception isn't reliable. It's fairly reliable, but it's not completely reliable. And so perception often needs a lot of interrogation. And I think that interrogation of what we notice is largely what yoga has been anyway, historically. It's the inquiry into the phenomena of the world and how it impacts you. Sometimes called phenomenology. I wouldn't call myself a phenomenologist, but I'm probably fairly close to that if I think about what I'm inquiring into, which is how do I experience the phenomena of the world and how does it impact me? And does it impact me well, or does it impact me badly? You know, does it help me or does it hinder me in the way I perceive these things? And that's for me now my exploration in yoga. So what I'm going to try and do today is I'm going to do a PowerPoint in a moment. I'll share a PowerPoint with you, which brings up some of the common, I think, if you look around the yoga world today, I think there are a few things that we are all sort of seeing in common. We see exercise as being, or yoga has been turned into some kind of industry that either is a substitute form of exercise or a kind of performance. And I'm trying to tease out the difference between what is performative, what is exercise, and what I would consider yoga to be. And so I'll give you my perspective on this in a PowerPoint. And then what I'd like to do when we finish is put you into breakout groups to talk about it for a bit, just to see how it's landed for you. So you talk to each other, and then we'll come back as a group and discuss it as a whole group. Then we'll probably have a cup of tea, and then we'll do some practice. And I'll try and put into practice and make it a little bit clearer what has come up in the PowerPoint. Does anyone want to come back at me? Does anyone want to ask questions before we start? Are there any things that you want to clarify about the course in general? Just if you do, just unmute yourself and speak. I know it's a bit funny to unmute yourself. Imagine you're in a room with me and you would just say something.
We get sent the PowerPoint, Pete. What's the situation with the PowerPoint?
How do you mean?
Do you send it to us, the PowerPoint, for us to keep for future?
It'll be on part of the recording. I'm recording the whole session and you'll all have access to the recording. So I imagine the PowerPoint will be recorded. I'm assuming that. If not, if it doesn't get recorded for some reason, I think it will. But if it doesn't get recorded, I'll obviously send it to you. But what I'm doing is I'm recording this whole, oh yes, I should probably make this point. I am recording these sessions and you'll have access to the recordings. I'll just send you the link for them. I'll send you all the link for them. Do be aware that it'll be me, what you'll see is me. It's not a library view, it's a speaker view. But if you unmute yourself and speak, you will pop up and you will be recorded. So if you have some kind of, if you don't fancy that, if you don't want to do that, don't chat to me rather than unmute yourself. But otherwise, what will happen is you will see the speaker view of the whole course. Is that reasonably clear? So if anyone doesn't want to be, yeah, Sarah.
Hi, I was thinking about the use of language because I was in a yoga class the other day online. I go to Bill Wood's classes online sometimes, and his yoga is definitely not performative or exercise in my experience, but he referred to something, a practice that we did as an exercise during that thing, and I felt that little like and I suppose it's my question is related to this use of language and how sometimes I can get a little bit pedantic about that, because even during my own teaching, sometimes I think, oh, I shouldn't use that word. But am I making sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I do think language is important, actually, and I do try and choose my words very carefully. For those very reasons, if we're trying to change, if we're teaching yoga that isn't exercise, then it's quite important that the people we're teaching understand that, and the language we use will be part of how we try and change their minds. I do want to make this point actually right at the beginning of this course. I know some of you quite well. I don't know others of you so well. I'm not trying to persuade you to teach my kind of yoga. I'm absolutely not trying to do that. What I'm assuming will happen during this course is it'll, some of the ideas will land and become part of your practice. You'll absorb the bits you like and you'll take them on board, and the bits you find unuseful, you'll leave to one side. That's just how it is. I'm not this isn't kind of any kind of evangelical quest to change everyone into my kind of yoga. Definitely not. I'd like to make that very clear. So these are my ideas. Of course, they are. They're the best I can offer you at the moment. And I've been studying this quite a long time. And this is where I've got to in my study. One of the other things I would like to say is that, as I say, this is probably about my 7th or 8th iteration of this course. And it's changed a lot. Sometimes I've worked with other people. I've done 2 courses one with Peter Connolly, one with a woman called Diane Farrell. I did 1 course with 5 other teachers. And it's really serendipity. This time there wasn't anyone around locally to work with, so I'm doing it on my own. Next time there may be someone I'll be working with. But I'm calling it a humanistic yoga course because I loosely, and I have a very loose attachment to humanism. You'll learn that I'm a believer in holding beliefs quite lightly, but humanism is a naturalistic way of viewing the world, with at its heart the idea of helping human beings flourish. That's the basic tenet. There are no sort of other beliefs other than it's a naturalistic view rather than a supernaturalistic view of life. And the idea is, how do we help each other in the world's journey? How do we do that? And I think yoga is a pretty good tool, actually. And that's where I'm going to start. So now, hopefully, I'm going to share this PowerPoint with you. Again, do stop me if there's something you want explained. Do try and imagine you're in a room with me, and that you can just stop and chat. It's the best way, for us to engage and learn about each other. If I hear you talk, and even small little concerns, I'd rather we talk them out, talk them through. I'm not expecting you to agree with everything I say. In fact, I kind of hope you don't. Right, let's see if I can get this up. Can you see this? Yeah, some thumbs up. Okay.
Yes.
Good.
Peter,
Yeah.
I was about to ask you to make it larger, but I think you've probably done that.
Say again?
I was
That should be full
larger.
screen now. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is that full
okay.
screen for you now? I've got it full screen. I hope that, yeah, okay. So the first part of this, well, we'll just go through this. These are my kind of thoughts about the practice today, how we practice yoga today. And what I bumped into, as many of you must have bumped into, there are lots of different styles of yoga. But there weren't when I started. There was Iyengar yoga, but it's now, there's 101 different styles of yoga, all kind of emphasizing different things. Some are more aerobic, some are more strength-based, some are more performative. And how do you choose? Are they all okay? How do we make decisions about these kind of things? These were kind of the questions that kept coming up for me, particularly as an Iyengar teacher, when things like Ashtanga started to develop, and then many other kinds of yoga started to develop. I became a bit more insecure about my Iyengar yoga. So I stopped and started to think of them like this. There are things that we do for exercise. Exercise is a thing I understand. And performance is a thing I understand. And play is a thing I understand. And all these are about the body. And yoga, I thought I understood. And I was trying to re-understand. So what this PowerPoint's about is how do I sift these ideas in my mind? Now I've categorized them a bit, and of course the categories have much more blurred edges than I'm probably going to portray now. So the way I define them is to help us think about them, not to. I don't want you to think I mentally do box them quite so explicitly as this. But if we start with exercise, why do people exercise and what is the point of exercise? There are always three main things. It's either to strengthen the body, or it's to improve flexibility, or it's to improve aerobic capacity, or it's a mixture of those three things. But that's what exercise is for. And if you think about that, its intention is in some way to change structure. That's the point. You change the strength of your muscles, the length of your tendons, the size of your heart or your blood vessels, in order to improve your physical body. And I think exercise is something whether you call it exercise or activity, is clearly a helpful thing for a sedentary culture. I'm pretty sure if you lived as a hunter-gatherer tribe, you probably would never think of exercise. Life would just be exercise enough. But we do live in a sedentary culture. So, many of us have to think about how we get our activity. It's something to understand about structures. I'm going very basically here. I don't know how much anatomy all of you have, so some of this is probably very obvious to you. Some of you may not be so clear about this, but the musculoskeletal system has three main types of tissue that we're interested in: bones, connective tissue, and muscles. And there are two laws that define how these things change. One is called Wolff's law, which relates to bone, and one is called Davy's law, which relates to soft tissues, muscles and ligaments and tendons. And Wolff's law states that bones will adapt to the loads they're put under, and they change their architecture, their internal architecture, depending on the loads that they're exposed to. So if you put lots of compressive loads through a femur, it'll develop an interior anatomy that will resist compressive loads. If you go up into a spaceship for a few hundred days, your bones will demineralize because they're not taking load, and they will become thinner and lighter. And it's the same with muscles and connective tissue. And it's pretty obvious, isn't it? You go into a gym and start lifting weights, your muscles get bigger. If you're in bed for 3 weeks because you've had, you've broken your leg or something, your muscles get weaker. And it's not just your muscles, but your connective tissue, your tendon, and your ligaments. They're all stressed by, they're all changed by stress, physical stress. And this is another thing perhaps you haven't thought of, or you might not have thought of it in this way. What are the functions of these three types of tissue in the body? And the function of muscle is to generate forces. That's what it does. So it's heavy on expenditure, if you like. Because it generates forces, it uses up a lot of calories. You have to burn fuel. It's the most energy expensive of the three. So it doesn't make sense. If evolution has provided bodies with anatomies and structures to relieve muscles of duty as much as it can, because it's so expensive. Evolution is like that. It develops economy over generations. But muscles generate forces. Bones transmit compressive forces. So their role is to deliver things like your body weight to the floor. That would be a compressive force that bones deal with. And connective tissue resists pulling forces. So this is their function in terms of anatomy, if you like. And we experience them all differently. So we sense them in different ways. They have different qualities of sensation. When you sense a muscle, you feel a stiffening of the tissues and a sense of what we could call effort, consolidation, tension, whatever word you want to choose. That's how we notice muscles. Or as they relax, you might sense them as softness, fluidity, liquefying. Muscles are largely water, actually. They're all blood. If you look at they're 80% liquid. So, but they have this fantastically odd quality, which means that when you think about them, when you send a a nerve impulse to a muscle and release calcium ions into the muscle tissues, the proteins that float around in the muscle cells react to each other in a way that the muscle stiffens. And then when you stop thinking about the muscle, the calcium ions get taken out of the cells, the proteins in them disengage, and you feel the muscle soften and liquefy. So the muscle is very odd in that way. It's one of the strange structure if you think about it. There aren't many other things that can go from a very liquid state to a very stiff state in a millisecond, but muscles can. We sense bone through feelings of weight, pressure on the floor. So whatever you're sitting on now, that's how your bones will be taking the main feeling of weight. So weight is how we notice, if we rest our hands on the floor, we lean into our hands, we feel the pressure of our body coming through our bones. We notice bones more as weight being transmitted through them, and we feel it as the weight of our bodies on the floor or whatever we're resting on. And connective tissue, which resists pulling forces, we feel that as stretch. So we have 3 different tissues with 3 different qualities, do 3 different jobs we experience in 3 different ways. So if we look at one of the aspects of exercise, increasing strength, why do people want to strengthen? I'm talking about this because when people come to your classes, if you're a teacher anyway, or if you're a practitioner and you may be thinking about these things, there are motivations. People have motivations, and to understand motivation helps you navigate the territory, because some of the motivations are good and some of the motivations are poor. So why do people want to become stronger? Well, one reason is because they're frail, they're very sedentary, or they're rehabilitating from an injury. And I think these are very good reasons why you might want to increase your strength. Because although there is actually some, when you get very old and very weak, the real problems seem to develop around your lack of strength. So there is a certain functionality of strength that we all need to keep ourselves healthy. So that there's a level below which, if our strength fails, we need to do something about it. But the next one, a belief about themselves that certain muscles are too weak and this contributes to pain. This is a very common belief and it's completely wrong. It's just not true. The number of people that come to me as an osteopath who say, my core is too weak, or I've got back pain because my back is too weak, or someone's told me my glutes don't fire, or something like that. This is a kind of idea that's got into mainstream thinking with very little serious research to underpin it. But a lot of people have this view and think they have to train particular muscles to get themselves out of trouble. And we'll unpack this much more as the course goes on, but it's a fallacious belief, and hopefully by the end of the course you'll be able to tell people why it's a fallacious belief. The other reason, of course, is aesthetic reasons. We want to look toned because it helps with self-confidence. Well, fair enough. I'm not going to argue with that. As long as it doesn't become an obsession, and of course it can do. And I think that's another side to gym work where people become slightly obsessed with how they look and spend too much time down there developing ridiculous muscles, because of a lack of confidence. And of course, muscle, just in case you're not sure about this, how do muscles get stronger? Well, obviously, you have to increase the cross-sectional area of a muscle to make it stronger. And to do that, you have to increase resistance to a muscle. So some people aren't quite aware of this, but it's true. If you're doing something like pull-ups which would increase the strength in your biceps, once you've got past about 10 or 15 chin-ups and you carry on doing them, your muscles don't get much bigger. what you do now is you're doing aerobic exercise for your muscles. If you want to make the muscles bigger, you have to increase the resistance. You have to wear a rucksack with bricks in it or something, to make yourself heavier, so that that's the way you would increase strength in muscles, or make muscles bigger. Otherwise, it becomes more of an aerobic task. I'm not hearing anyone come back at me, so I'll just carry on. If you want to stop me at any point, do stop me and I'll stop. But if I don't hear anyone stop, I'll just carry on. So, and we look at flexibility. It's another reason people do exercise, to become more mobile. And again, just to understand motivation here, a good one is when we're recovering from an injury or restoring range of movement to normal after a sedentary life. If you're very sedentary, your range of movement does diminish. And that's, that's kind of problematic. Someone's trying to come in. I wonder how I can do this. I've got to exit this. I've had this problem before. When I'm on screen share, I lose my mouse. And I'm trying to escape from screen share. I might just end it. Oh no, let's end meeting. I don't want to do that. Nicola, you, this is annoying.
Hey, Pete, if you're familiar with Alt Tab or Command Tab to switch between applications, sometimes for me, if you switch to another application and come back, your mouse reappears.
Okay. Not very much luck here. Why can't I escape from this?
Hit your escape key as well. That might minimize.
Hang on.
Or the space bar takes you out of play sometimes.
No.
Press stop share.
Yeah, I lost my mouse. I can't get to stop share. How annoying. And when I press escape, I just get a beeping noise. Apologize about this. Something I'm going to have to get to grips with. So I'll just spend a moment or two trying to figure this out.
Pete, do you use a mouse path or do you use
I've got a. Hang on. I've got a trackpad.
So is there a light burning on the trackpad or not?
No.
Okay.
Pause share. Hang on, what's that? Hang on. I'm really sorry about this. So what's happened is someone's left the meeting and has joined in, and when they've come back in, I can't admit them without getting out of the screen share. And now I've realized I'm having trouble getting out of the screen share anyway.
Can you press Control, Alt, and Delete at the same time? And that
Control,
Alt, and Delete.
Which is the Alt button? Sorry, on a Mac.
It should. I don't have a Mac.
No.
Anyone?
Pete, I've got a Mac, and
okay.
my Alt button's next to my Control button.
Okay, I've got FN. No. Options. No.
To the right, it's to the right of the control button.
Okay.
But you usually use command on a Mac rather than control, don't you?
Okay, if I promote, if I hit command,
On a PC.
okay. This is,
Does escape not take you out of full screen?
I've got, there we go. Now I can, now I don't know how that happened. Okay, now I can admit Nicola. One thing I could do is just not do this on play. I could keep this like this, actually. It might be better. It's not quite so slick. But when I go into play the PowerPoint, it takes me, I lose my mouse. Whereas if I just do it like this, you know, in the non-play version, you can still see it okay, can't you?
It looks no different. We can't tell.
Okay, well, then I'll do this. So
Google says that command and tab.
Command and tab, okay. All right.
But whether that works in future, I don't know.
But I think what I'm going to do is leave it like this, because now I've got control again. Okay, so we're back to flexibility. Recovering from injury, restoring range of movement. That's good. The belief that being more mobile reduces the risk of injury. Well, there's very little.
Pete,
Yeah.
I have a different screen to the one that you
Okay.
seem to have moved it on. I don't know whether anybody else is in that position, but I have improving aerobic capacity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I have.
Yeah.
You've got that. Oh Lord.
We've all got that.
Okay, because I'm not screen share. Oh, I am still screen sharing, aren't I? Oh, hang on. I see what I've done. Sorry. There. Is that now back to increase? Have you got increasing flexibility now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Yeah, I paused the screen share. Sorry. So yeah, so we're on increasing flexibility. Why do people want to improve flexibility? Well, you know, the first one is reasonable. If we're recovering from an injury and your knees got stiff, your ankles got stiff, you want to get back to normal, that's fine. Or if you've been very sedentary and you realize you've just stiffened up and can't sit on the floor anymore, you know, these are very reasonable reasons to want to improve your range of movement. There's very little evidence to support the belief that being more mobile reduces the risk of injury. In fact, I was reading a study the other day that said it might actually stretching, you know, for mobility when you're doing athletics might even sometimes increase the risk of injury. So that's quite a contentious one. The other one, to be able to perform some activities not previously explored. Yeah, maybe if you're an acrobat, if you're doing some kind of sport that needs more flexibility, then maybe that's a good idea. So it's just understanding why people want to become more flexible. But a lot of people think it is about injury, you know, that somehow being more mobile, people who are very flexible don't hurt themselves as often. Well, they do. And they're in as much pain as people who are stiffer. There's no correlation between those two at all.
Pete, can I just?
Yeah.
So I think if you ask that question, a lot of people can't answer why they want to be more flexible. They just think they should be. I don't think I would have been able to answer that question before I started to train to be a teacher and came along to your sessions.
Well, I think one of the things I think in yoga you see, we've created these idealized forms in yoga, you know, what dog pose should look like. Whether we believe it or not, we've absorbed these through media, through other teachers, and some people are able to get into the idealized shape, you know, whether it's a face-up dog, a face-down dog, a trikonasana, whatever posture we're thinking about. And most of those postures require a certain amount of flexibility to do. And, you know, we'll notice that anatomically, it's not always possible for some people, but there's also this sort of belief that people, well, it's not just a belief, is it? That there is some truth in the when we look at dancers, people who have an easy range of movement, they're born with easy bodies in that sense. There's something graceful that we maybe aspire to, we wish about, we wish we're a bit like that, but it has got nothing to do with pain or function. You know, that there is no truth in the idea that people who move more, you know, people who look very graceful don't have pain. Ballet dancers are notoriously suffering from pain all the time, and yet on the stage they look absolutely gorgeous, you know, in the ease of movement. So yeah, you're right. It's why do we want to become more flexible? I think in yoga historically, it's just, certainly from the Iyengar point of view, it was just the more flexible you were, the more credibility you had. So I think there's a long hangover from that. And if you look at the Ashtanga series, you know, once you get past series 1, you have to be monstrously flexible to do half the postures, even though in life we don't need any of that kind of flexibility. How do we, what happens, you know, how do we change range of movement? Well, there's no doubt that if you keep on taking your body to its end range of movement on a regular basis, the range of movement tends to increase to a greater and lesser extent in different people. I haven't got this on the PowerPoint, but collagen, there are about 30 different forms of collagen, which is the most abundant protein in the body. It's the protein that all our tendons and ligaments are made of, and all the fascia in our body is made of. And some of it is is stiffer, and some is more elastic. Some of it is dangerously elastic, you know, so there is a spectrum of flexibility that people have in connective tissues, genetically determined. Some people are born actually quite tightly strung, and some people are born very loosely strung. And if it's too loosely strung, it goes into a pathology that's sometimes called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And many flexible yoga people are on that spectrum and are actually clinically, you know, have a condition, because conditions, you know, we name it. And those people often suffer pain and joint problems. So actually the last thing a flexible person really needs to do is stretch. But when we do engage with our tissues, two things seem to happen. Tissues will grow a little bit longer. Muscles will grow more sarcomeres. The functional unit of a muscle is called a sarcomere. They're the parts of a muscle that cells kind of live in, little packets of muscle cells that are in series. And if you stretch a lot, you tend to grow more sarcomeres. If you stop stretching, the sarcomeres get reabsorbed into the body. And the other thing that happens, and this is something that I think will be experienced by most of the people who do yoga with me, you know, most of the people who do yoga on a reasonably regular basis, but don't practice sort of hours a day, is that anything you do over time on a regular basis, the central nervous system tends to give the muscle more permission to relax, to do that thing. So there is a change in the kind of set that the central nervous system will allow. You know, how long will a muscle lengthen? One of the received wisdoms is that muscles tend to give feelings of discomfort when they reach about 2/3 of their functional length. So the feeling of stretch starts to kick in about 2/3 along the line of our functionality, the ability of that muscle to stretch before it breaks. And between the 2/3 and the damage to the tissues is an increasing sense of stretch.
Can I just ask something there, Pete?
Sure.
When you were talking about, I was thinking repeating the yoga practice. So, for example, repeating Trikonasana, etc.
Yeah.
But it must fall over into other areas, because I can put my leg over my bike much more easily with my yoga practice, but I'm not practicing in my yoga putting my leg over my bike.
Yes, well, it's true. If your range of movement increases, you know, if your hip flexibility increases, that will be an advantage in anything where you need to open your hips. Yeah, for sure. We'll come on to some slightly more interesting things around mapping later, not in this session, but in the following session, about how much the things we do in yoga relate to everyday functions. But it's true that if we, if you do yoga regularly and you ride your bike regularly, you'll have two familiar maps in your body. One is a bike riding map and one is a yoga map, and there'll be a certain amount of overlap in those with opening your hips.
Yes, yeah.
And then aerobic capacities. It's one of the more common reasons why people exercise. Well, it's very big, isn't it? Prevention of cardiovascular disease. This is well understood. It's very important that we are active human beings. I'm taking no issue with these things. Improves one's well-being. If you've got a dog like I have, you go out, you walk the dog. It's just great. Being outside, moving around. If you like jogging, running, that's great. I've got no problem with that. I think, I certainly think we also get a sense of virtue when we do these things. And it can get, like any kind of exercise, I think there's a point where it becomes counterproductive, when it becomes almost addictive. Particularly when we exercise if we push ourselves to a limit, when we start to take ourselves to an edge, the body starts releasing dopamine, that we can get hooked on. The highs we get, exercise highs. Endogenous drugs are just as addictive as exogenous drugs. And I've noticed one of my friends who started off running ended up doing 50-mile marathons, and hurt herself quite a lot in the process, but couldn't stop doing it. So there was something that had become compulsive that had then become unhealthy. So, all these things are on a kind of bell curve, where at each end of the bell curve, it's not so great. You don't do enough and you're not going to be healthy. You do too much, you're not going to be healthy. But in between, there's quite a wide range of things that we can do that people find enjoyment of. So when we, yep, sorry, did you want
running is one that I used to love running.
Mm-hmm.
And I did the London Marathon. I ran a lot, and then my knees screamed at me, and I had to stop. And I'd still love to go out and run now, but I if I did that, I couldn't walk, I couldn't do yoga. So then it becomes a balancing exercise. So you then, okay, I trade off the running to do other stuff that I like. Yeah. But it was a long process that took me to get there.
I could argue that what might have been another alternative is just to run less, or was it?
I tried that. No, I did so much that I'd actually,
you got yourself into trouble.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this is something this is something we could talk about now. Load versus tissue tolerance. This is always the balancing act with exercise. To change tissue, you have to load tissue. As we said, the muscles, to get them bigger, you have to use resistance to improve your aerobic capacity. You have to run further. To stretch, you have to push your body, stretch them a little bit more if you want to keep on increasing these things. But if you go too far, if you go past your tissue tolerance, you damage yourself. So there's a balancing act between how much we want to load our tissues to improve the quality of our tissues. And I think, that's important to have resilient tissues. We do want that. But we don't want to, many people seem to feel that they have to keep on going harder and harder. And then they go past the point of their tissue tolerance, and then they damage their tissues. And then you get, then they can't exercise. And then they get into this kind of yo-yoing, exercising, hurting themselves. So there is always that balance. Tissues are always regenerating. They're always healing. You just, we're an organic structure. We're biological. So the processes that we damage ourselves, but we heal. But if you keep on then doing too much, you'll keep damaging yourself. But in terms of aerobic capacity, what happens to our bodies when we do that is we increase the size of the heart, we grow miles of capillaries. I mean, miles. It's unbelievable how many more capillaries we develop if we really start to do a lot of running. And we manufacture more red blood cells. So we're changing structure in that way. So when I think about exercise, it has many health benefits. And one of the things that we do know, that being sedentary is bad for us. That is the take home thing in terms of our health. Being sedentary is bad for us. How much exercise we want, and what kind of exercise we want, I think is very, very personal. Some people love going down the gym. Some people love cycling. Some people love swimming. Some people love walking. I don't think it really matters. And I don't, there've been lots of studies on short bouts of intense exercise or long bouts of gentle exercise. I think most people are trying to prove a point there. Be generally active most of the time is a useful edict. It is worth noticing that yo-yo exercising, probably a bit like yo-yo dieting, is probably not worth doing. If you start doing your jogging and then you stop after about 8 weeks of not doing your exercise, you've pretty well drifted back to where you were before you started your exercise. So I always think it's a better strategy if you find you're not a natural exerciser, if you don't like gym work, if you don't play a sport, try and find ways of introducing activity into your life. If you get a bus to work, get off the bus 2 stops early and walk the rest of the way. Use stairs and not lifts. Just simple things. Introduce it into your life, because being active is clearly important for our health. Yeah, it's just sure.
Not sure how to do that. I suppose the things that come into my mind are when you were talking about developing muscle strength.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about specificity of training and how we kind of get good at what we do. So, if your intention is to improve, let's say, muscle endurance, then you might work with a higher repetition load than you might if you were trying to increase the strength. And I guess that to carry that over into all the other things that you're talking about, and I think you've really covered this, but I just felt like I wanted to say it, that we have our bodies. So we only have our bodies that we can work with. So, for example, if I wanted to, I spent some years doing quite a lot of distance running, but I'm aware now that I picked up injuries from that over time, and that structurally my body isn't well designed for the kind of training that I was doing. So I kind of reached a performance limit.
Yeah.
And I guess that it's part of the human nature to want to, not always, but often to want to realize their full capacity within a certain field. So whilst, I would have liked to have carried on and run not so much further, but the same distance at a faster pace, my body was coming back at me and telling me that it wasn't prepared to be pushed beyond that limit. But I didn't know that until I'd gone beyond it. And I suppose that within, because we're talking about yoga, that we have to be really clear about teaching people to listen and understanding why it is we're trying to teach people certain things.
Sure.
Because
I agree.
If I'm teaching somebody to do something that actually isn't going to serve them very well in their sort of day-to-day life, then is there any value in doing that? That's really something that I've sort of gleaned from the work that I've done with you. But then also to recognize in myself that there are postures that may not serve me well in my life. There are shapes that I like to explore, but simply for the challenge of doing them, as long as I'm clear in my own mind that it's not going to do me any harm.
Clarity.
So like handstand or forearm balance, I find those postures quite interesting to play around with. So if I take out the achievement part of it, so I'm not trying to do it, but I'm interested in the journey that takes me there and what it is that actually in my body doesn't allow me to get there. I just feel like as long as I'm clear about that, then it can't be a bad thing. In the same way as, you know, if I want to run a half marathon in less than an hour and a 30, then that can't be a bad thing until my body tells me that maybe that's not a good idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we'll absolutely, I'm on that page. So yeah, I agree with you. Okay. So yes, this was just this part was just about what kind of exercise is best. I think everyone's trying to find that, but I honestly think the best exercises are the ones that you enjoy. And I wouldn't make it more complicated than that. Or I wouldn't even say exercise, I would say what kind of activity do you enjoy or do you find is okay for you? And stick to that. You know, don't, if you're trying to do something you don't enjoy, you probably stop doing it after a short time. Now, this is the other thing that we want to talk about. Sorry, someone's just busted the window. Hello? Oh, I'll let you in. She might be. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. So performance is another aspect that I sometimes think, well, definitely does creep into yoga. But if you're clear about what performance means, performance is always about improving a skill. And it's nearly always a motor skill of some sort. And they vary from very large ones like dance and gymnastics to quite small ones like dance, calligraphy, and playing a musical instrument. They're all motor skills. And there is something interesting about performance because it has similarities to yoga in that you do have to pay a lot of attention and you do have to repeat things to improve any skill. So, and that's true of yoga too. We do have to attend to our yoga practice and we do have to repeat our yoga practice to get something out of it. So there are similarities between performance and yoga. But the difference with performance is that the end game in a performance is the performance. So you know, if you're trying to do a dance routine, if you're a choreographer and you've got your dancers dancing on a stage, your aim is to get them to move, to look at a particular way as beautifully as you can, as whatever it is, the effect you're trying to get. And the health of the body is secondary to the performance. So the performance takes priority, the health of the performer, or in other words, we quite often suffer for our art. And I'm not critical of that. You know, if I want to go and see a dance performance and I realize how much pain and suffering those dancers may have gone through, it makes me appreciate them even more. But yoga isn't about that. The one thing I forgot to say about exercise is that exercise doesn't need attention. So I can lift weights in a gym and my muscles will get bigger and I could be thinking about anything in the world. You know, my mind doesn't have to be on what I'm doing. I could be running on a treadmill and watching a TV screen. I don't have to attend. Structure doesn't need attention. It needs force. It needs forces acting on your structure in order to change it. Performance needs attention and repetition. So they're slightly different. Yeah, this is just what I've said, really. Except for the last one, and this is something I think we might tease out over time. Some people often find this, we need to define our terms a little bit. The pursuit of stretching, which is what yoga has historically certainly been very invested in, is a strange shifting of or meaning of a sensory experience. So the feeling of stretch is fundamentally an increasingly loud warning sign to protect us from tissue damage. So, you know, if you kind of stretch your leg harder and harder, what you get is a louder and louder noise. Why is that? It was because if you keep on stretching, at some point you'll snap a tendon. So you know, the reason we have a feeling of stretch isn't to pursue it because it feels good. It's actually to back off when it gets too loud. That's an important thing to understand. And yet, and this is why perception is interesting, we can modify a feeling that is, you know, really trying to tell us to back off and turn it into a feeling that we actually start to pursue. Now, one of the ways I try and explain is that if you take somebody's finger and start bending it back, you know, that's a feeling of stretch. But nobody goes, oh yeah, that's a great feeling. Can you keep going? You know, because it's just not what we do. It hurts, you know. Or you put someone on a rack and keep turning the wheels. People don't go, yeah, keep turning the wheels. This is a nice feeling. At some point, you know, the feeling of stretch becomes pain. And that's because stretch is trying to tell us that we're getting closer and closer and closer to a breaking of a tissue. And it's interesting how we can make a painful feeling. You know, we hear these words like sweet pain, or, you know, just getting to that point, you know, that hurts a bit. And I'm very wary of that. I think it's an interesting thing that we've gone through in yoga. We've tried to persuade people that pursuing stretch is a good idea. Now, I do want to differentiate this from natural pandiculation. And I'm taking the word pandiculation to mean it in its literal sense, which is to stretch when you've, you know, been not moving for a time. The kind of thing we do if we get out of a car, we stretch our arms and legs, or when we first get up in the morning. And all animals do this. This is the response to the contraction of connective tissue. Connective tissue, collagen, tendency, if you leave it alone, is to shorten, which is why if you're in a coma for any length of time, you have to have physios moving and stretching your limbs all the time, because the nature of a collagen fiber is it will, over time, if you leave it alone, it'll get shorter and shorter and shorter, and you'll develop clonus in your joints. You won't be able to straighten your elbows, your wrists, your fingers, your knees. Even overnight, or when you're sitting in a car or been in a plane for 4 or 5 hours and you haven't moved, you sense that shortening of connective tissue as stiffness. And then what our response is to stretch it. And this feeling of stiffness goes, and that's a very natural thing. That's not pursuing stretch, that's taking stiffness out of the body, which is clearly a very normal thing.
Pete, about pandiculation, doesn't pandiculation also involve a contraction with the lengthening as opposed to just pulling on tissues like a stretch would?
Well, it depends on how you're using the term. You know, Hannah Somatics has taken the term and used it in a slightly different way. So somatics people tend to talk about, if I'm right here, as a kind of oscillatory movement, not as the yawning, stretching feeling that most of us have when we get up. Pandiculation in the sense that I'm thinking of it is simply the response to get rid of a feeling of stiffness in the body when you've been still for a long time. I know the term has been changed a bit through the somatics teachers who will explain it slightly differently and talk about stretch reflexes and Golgi tendon organs. But I'll park that one because we'll come up against that kind of question later on, if you don't mind. I included play because that's another way we use the body. And most of us go through periods of, you know, when we're young, and all animals do, playing. And playing really is about learning to map our bodies. It seems it's most, you know, to gain experience of our bodies doing things that we'll need later on in life. And, you know, and it's fun. And most people seem to stop playing as they get older. Maybe that's just because we've mapped our bodies and we have no more need for it, or maybe it's just because we've become boring. I'm not sure. But I think play is quite a good idea. I still like it, clambering around and climbing frames and climbing up trees when I have the urge. And, you know, obviously it reduces stress and improves mood. Play is a nice thing to do. But again, I'm going to argue it's not yoga. So now we come to yoga. And this is how I'm thinking about it. Historically, because, you know, if we look back, yoga is sometimes can be considered a form of soteriology, which is a way out of suffering. And most big systems have a soteriology, have a purpose, if you like. Why did people do yoga? Why did people become Buddhists or Christians? Because there is some promise of an end to suffering through different routes. You know, Christian soteriology might be that you follow the teachings of Jesus and the world will become a better place, you know, or if you're a Hindu, you might want to follow your Dharma, or if you're a Buddhist, you might want to learn about attachment and non-attachment as ways of dealing with what causes suffering in our life. And I like, you know, I'm still very interested in this, except that I'm not religious, you know, so I don't, although I see elements of truth in a lot of these things, from the point of view I'm at, which is and you know, in a sense, Vanda Scaravelli's point of view, what do I notice when I get on my mat and practice? So I'm thinking of it now from an embodied, or if you want to look at it philosophically, a phenomenological point of view. How do I engage with phenomena, and how does it make me feel? And how can I engage in it in a way that makes me feel better and the world feel better? It is something I've become more and more interested in. So if we take an embodied perspective, I'm not even sure I like the word embodied, but I couldn't think of another one, because an embodied perspective means you could have a disembodied perspective, and you can't, of course. So in a sense, I could say from a human perspective, but I think that's not quite clear enough at the moment. But I tend to use human more now as a word than embodied. But from an embodied perspective, we need to consider a few things. You know, this idea of separateness and connectedness is really all about the sensory nervous system, because the boundaries of ourselves do not end at our skin. That's pretty obvious. They extend as far as our senses can perceive. And what we notice changes us constantly. And you know, that may not seem intuitively correct, but it's an ongoing process. Moment by moment, we notice things, and our physiology either continues in a similar way or changes mildly. You might hear something I say, something happens in the room. I've just noticed the temperature in this room is dropping and I want to turn a radiator on. So, you know, my motivations change. I'm in a constant process of dialogue with my environment that's changing me. And when I'm interacting with people, I'm changing them. So we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about the way we perceive those relationships. And we're noticing whether these changes are helpful or harmful. Do they promote well-being or not? And that becomes interesting. That often, I can't say it's 100% of the time, but often when things go wrong in the world, we look for a fault. It was him or her, it was that political party or this political party, it was that man or this woman. Instead of looking at how things relate, we do it with body parts as well. You know, my psoas is in spasm, and you kind of blame the part, forgetting that actually it's your psoas and you have a relationship with it, and there's something going on between you and that. So I'm interested often in relationships between things more than I am about the parts of things. And we do live in a very part-driven world, and the next time we meet, we'll be talking about this, because there are lots of very fashionable parts of the body. You know, in my kind of lifetime, I've been through a psoas fashion, a fascia fashion, a vagus nerve fashion. We're quite in that one at the moment. Cerebrospinal fluid fashion, you know, where people take apart the body and amplify its meaning and think, instead of realizing that these are just parts of a human being and have no agency on their own. And it's much better to see systems, the way things interrelate, than it is to see things. Usually, when you look at the way things relate to each other, you're more likely to come to some more useful conclusion than if you look at a part. Parts thinking is mechanistic. It works really well with cars. You know, don't worry about the whole car if you've run out of petrol, put more petrol in it. But, you know, with human beings, if something's going wrong with it, it's a bit like with the plant. We're biological creatures. If you think about a plant and it's wilting, you don't inspect the leaves and try and wonder what part of the leaf is wilting. You think, well, it's either not getting enough light, or it's not getting enough water, or it's too hot. You know, it's something to do with the way the environment and the plant are interacting that's important. So biological creatures are always systemic. They live in systems, ecosystems, and how well they do is something to do with their relationship to their system. It's rarely about their parts. Although, of course, you know, we can all think of times when someone's had a hip transplant or a hip replacement and it's improved their life. So we can think of those instances, but health is really systemic, about relationships, rarely about parts. And now I want to come into this part, talking about our sensory nervous system. This is where I've got very interested in. This is what I've been studying most of all in the last few years. So there are four main ways we get information about the world. Exteroception, which tells us about the external world through eyes, ears, nose, and touch. Proprioception, how we notice what our body is doing in space, where it is and how fast it's moving, and the effort we bring to our actions. Interoception, how we notice the state of our internal milieu. How do we feel on the inside? Things like hunger, thirst, excretion, need for breath. But also if you feel bloated or not, if you have running a temperature, these are all interoceptive feelings. And they tell us about our kind of existential self. Are we in danger internally? Is our life being threatened through lack of food, lack of water, etc. And nociception, these are threat detectors, and they signal feelings of pain or discomfort when there is damage or threat of damage to tissues. So nociception we'll talk more about when we have the pain lecture. But nociception is very much related to beliefs, as well as it is to actual tissue damage. I want to define my terms a little bit with interoception, because I'll talk about this quite a lot over the course. It hasn't got a defined meaning, depends on who's talking about it. And currently, I think there's a kind of generalized culture that says interoception is any feeling that arises from within the body. And I think that's a poor definition. So I'm not going to use that one, because that means proprioception is interoception. And proprioception has a very specific meaning, as does nociception and as does interoception. So I'm going to talk about interoception. They used to call it visceroception, the feelings that I get from the inside of my body that are carried along particular nerve pathways. And the nerve pathways actually are mainly the vagus and the glossopharyngeal nerve. These are our two most interoceptive nerves. And the interesting thing about these three types of sensory input, so interoception, proprioception, nociception and exteroception, all these 4 types of sensory input have specific nerve pathways to send specific messages to my brain to make specific meaning of those messages. So proprioception will have a different meaning to interoception, which will have a different meaning to nociception, which will have a different meaning to exteroception. I'm just going to turn the radiator up because I'm starting to get cold.
So, Pete, I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Carry on.
Would emotion come into any of these?
Well, you see, this is where I think it gets really important that we do define our terms. Think about it. There are no nerve pathways for emotion. I haven't got a specific nerve pathway for love or for hate or for Schadenfreude. So emotions, and I'm leaning very heavily on Damasio here and Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, who I'll encourage you to look into. Emotions are emergent properties of feelings. So we have, well, let's just clarify this. So what I'm trying to explain here is we have these 4 main ways we gather information about the world. One of the ways to think about sensory input is to imagine what our sensory nervous system is trying to do is inform the brain, which is inside a black box, and effectively it's inside the skull. It's trying to inform the brain about what's going on in the world. And so the brain is sort of asking its nervous system to send messages back. What can it see? What can it feel? What can it smell? What can it touch? And also the organism itself, are you hungry? Are you thirsty? And then the brain is making sense of all these things. So the brain is making sense of sensory data. The sensory data is almost meaningless until the brain has interpreted it. And the brain interprets sensory experience based on prior experience. So it's predictive. When it gets a message from my sensory nervous system, the brain is thinking, what did that mean last time I felt this? It's probably the same thing. And then predicts output based on the meaning it's made previously from similar sensory inputs. If you think about interoception, it developed when creatures became more than single cellular creatures. When creatures became multicellular, the creature needed to know whether the cells deep within its structure were well or not. Did they have enough oxygen? Did they have enough food? Were they able to excrete their waste material? And how did they find that out? Well, we had to evolve some kind of message to help the organism modify its behavior to meet the needs of all its cells. So an interoceptive nervous system evolved to inform the developing creature, the evolving creature, about the state of its internal world, whereas the exteroceptive nerve pathways told it about the external world. So we have this internal environment and an external environment we're being informed about all the time. There is something really important to understand about interoceptive nerves, and I need to teach you a little bit of anatomy now. And I don't want to burden you with too much anatomy, but there is a big distinction or a big difference between interoceptive nerves and the other types of sensory nerves. All the others are called myelinated nerves. Some of you will know what that means, some of you won't, but fundamentally what it means is the nerves have a coating around the outside, a fatty sheath, an insulation, a bit like a plastic coating around electric wire. And it stops that nerve having any interactions with the chemicals that surround the nerve, so that when light lands on my retina, the information landing on my retina travels uninterfered with along my optic nerve to the part of my brain that decodes that message. and you want to have a fairly pure representation. You know, I want my brain to have an uninterfered message of what is out in the world. I want it to be a fairly pure signal. Interoceptive nerves are non-myelinated. They have no coating, which means any chemicals within our internal organs, the circulating in the fluids of our body, in our blood and our interstitial fluids and our intracellular fluids, all the fluids that circulate around these nerves, they'll be carrying chemicals like cortisols and adrenalines and serotonins and dopamines, different chemicals that mean different things to the body. The interoceptive nerves in the Damascus will literally taste the environment they're living in. So the interoceptive nerves have the most direct contact with ourselves of all the nerve pathways. Our interoceptive nerves are embedded in, marinating in the fluids in which they're embedded, and they take on all along the length of the nerve, just not at the axon and the dendrite, not just at the ends of the nerves, but all along the length of the nerve. They're receiving messages from the chemicals that are circulating around them. So if my bloodstream is heavy in cortisol and adrenaline, my interoceptive nerves will know that, and I will feel agitated. My heartbeat will increase, my respiration will increase, my whole nervous system will feel more on the alert. This is not the same as other sensory nerves. So interoceptive nerves are a kind of special case. Damasio says, yeah, carry on.
Atrial fibrillation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's got to do with the vagus nerve. Is this part of the interoception and atrial fibrillation? Are they very closely connected?
Well, there can be lots of different reasons why someone's heart can start beating in a different rhythm. But there are certainly some circumstances when the heart beats erratically because of the chemicals that are circulating in your bloodstream. About 20 years ago, I was going through a very stressful part of life when my son was small, and I don't know, my sister was ill. It was just very, very stressful. And my heart started to beat irregularly. It was a terrifying feeling, actually. It was a very weird feeling to feel something inside you jumping around and then stop beating and then beating irregularly. And of course, I went to the doctors and had an electrocardiogram, and exactly that. He said, well, this is just stress. These are stress hormones changing your physiology. Try and manage your life better. But actually, just the reassurance that I wasn't dying it did a lot to reduce the fibrillations. But there are other things. You can have damage to nerves, to the heart. There can be changes in parts of the brain that can cause atrial fibrillation. So there are I can't say it's just one thing. There are lots of reasons why a heart may start beating erratically.
And the electrical conductive pathways can be disturbed as well. That's one of the major causes of AF, because it responds to, you shock someone and get them back into, I can't remember, cardioversion. You shock them into the normal rhythm.
The nerve pathways to the heart are very complex, aren't they? To control the synchronized beating of the heart. If it goes out of sync, you do feel very strained.
Pete, are you also talking about things that we might put into our body, like alcohol or drugs?
Yeah, of course. Well, I'd have to think about that, because some drugs act more in the brain than they do in the gut, actually. I'm not a pharmacologist, so I can't give you I couldn't be sure about that. A lot of the exogenous drugs we take, I think, work on receptors in the brain, but there will be some that will work on interoceptive nerves. I'm sure there will be. I don't know enough about it to give you a good answer there.
I'm thinking about physiologically my own experience with some skin creams, quite a lot of things that are put on topically. And actually I experience like a shock in my body. I have it, but it's not an allergy.
Yeah. I don't know where, I couldn't give you a good answer for that. So I'll be on too thin ice.
I suppose as well, in terms of how do these things, the sort of what you describe as exteroception and interoception, how do they come together? So a hot room for me would be quite anxiety provoking, but that may not be the same for somebody else. And I only know it as anxiety because of what I feel inside, and I label that in a particular way.
Well, I was going to say, we're going to get onto all this, Lynette. So I'll be talking about how we make sense of experience, because this is really what I'm interested in.
Can I just ask, where it links into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system? Where does interoception sit? Is it or
well, interoception will be the the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system are part of our interoceptive nervous system, part of the experience we have of, the sympathetic nervous system, as you know, will be stimulating certain types of chemicals into our bloodstream, and the parasympathetic nervous system, other chemicals that will have either enervating or a de-enervating effect on our system. So interoception is, the vagus nerve is part of our parasympathetic nervous system, all the cranial nerves are. And the difficulty here is I don't want to fall into the merological fallacy here where we get caught up in parts of ourselves again. What happens is sensory input comes into us and we respond as a whole organism. We're responding to exteroception, interoception, nociception, and proprioception all the time. And our body's making sense of the whole lot as an experience based on past experience. And if we get too sidetracked down, and you'll notice I'll try to steer us away from getting caught up in understanding which part of our body is causing what feeling, because it's much more complicated than that. You can try and chase these things down and say, well, we need to have certain vagal tone in order to calm ourselves down. Well, the vagus nerve acting on its own can do nothing without my memory being part of it, without my cortex being part of it, without my other parts of my sensory nervous system being part of the way I engage with the world. I don't engage with the world with a vagus nerve. I engage with the world as a whole human being all the time. And we're making sense of experience all the time. And that's what I'm trying to get into, how we notice the world. What is the meaning we give to what we notice in the world rather than what is the mechanism, which is, I think, often where we've gone wrong in yoga. We've got caught up in mechanisms, both muscularly and neurologically. So people worry about whether their amygdala is firing all right, another part of the brain, instead of thinking, well, how do I feel? Okay.
William, just a quick question. Does that mean that the vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve both have solely unmyelinated fibers, or is it a combination of both?
I'm pretty sure both these are completely unmyelinated. I'm pretty sure of that. It may be, and I'll have to check this, it may be that the motor part of it may be myelinated, but the sensory part is unmyelinated because they both have motor and sensory aspects.
That is wicked cool. Thank you for saying that.
Okay. Now, we get to kind of the nub of all this, which is the emergence of feelings. So we know chemicals that circulate in our body, like adrenaline, cortisol, serotonin, many other chemicals, there's a whole pharmacology of them inside us, change our physiology. And as it changes our physiology, it'll change the tonus in our muscles, it may change the beating of our heart, our respiration, change our digestion. These changes of chemistry, body state, give rise to certain feelings that we notice. And feelings motivate behavior. So the point about the emergence of feelings in creatures with nervous systems is to motivate behavior one way or another. If the feelings are positive and good, then the creature will tend to want to do more of that. If the feelings are negative and harmful, then it'll make the creature steer away from that. Feelings aren't emotions, and I do want to make this point. So when I'm practicing yoga, I'm very interested in leading people to feelings, not to emotions. I'm trying to make a distinction here. When I use the term feelings, I'm not talking about emotions. How do you feel isn't I feel happy or I feel sad. In the way I'm going to be using it, feeling will be I feel weight, I feel effort, I feel movement, I feel quiet, I feel I was going to say agitated, but that's almost an emotion. I feel mobilized would be the kind of word you could use to talk about a feeling where you're energetic inside. Damasio thinks that these interoceptive feelings that we have, because they are so tied in with the state of our internal fluids, that when we notice our state, he thinks, or he argues, this is where we get our sense of self from. These aren't feelings that come from anywhere else. Exteroception comes from the outside. Proprioception comes from our relationships to the world. Interoception is explicitly about us and how we feel. It's nothing to do with anybody else. This is very much about the self. So interoceptive feelings are all about the state of me, my organism, how well I feel. And Damasio argues that this is the origins when these states of internal feeling are noticed, they give us a sense of existence, of self. So in his book, which if you want to read more Damasio, his book, When Self Comes to Mind, is all about that. His latest book, Knowing and Feeling, or Feeling and Knowing, I really encourage you to read because it's so rich in the way the nervous system informs us about ourselves. And he's really on top of the game. So yeah, we'll wrap up on these things. Proprioception. These are nerve endings embedded in muscles, ligaments, and fascia. They're always myelinated. And they tell us about where our body is in space, how fast or slowly we're moving, and the amount of effort that's being used in movement, or how much stretch there is, how much strain there is on the body. Proprioceptive nerves all have a common route to the brain through the dorsal root ganglia of the spine. If you never lose proprioception, but there are very occasional situations where people have had viruses where all their dorsal root ganglia have been destroyed by a virus, very specifically and only. So they have lost proprioception. And there's a very good story in Oliver Sacks's book, The Man That Mistook His Wife for a Hat. I think it's called The Disembodied Woman or something like that. And she goes through this experience. And without proprioception, you just can't move. all your motor functions are there, but you have no idea where your body is in space. So, you know, your arms flail around, your legs flail around, you can't walk, you can't organize your body to move. You can reteach yourself to move by looking at where your body is in space and learning. But it's a very kind of clumsy and automated movement. And if the lights go out, you can't move again. So proprioception, you know, if you close your eyes, you should always do this trick. You just close your eyes and bring your finger to your nose. And the very fact you can do that, you know, it's quite amazing. It's that's all about proprioception. We just do know where our body is in space if we're healthy, if we're lucky, if we have no problems with our nervous system. That's what our proprioception does for us. And the other thing about it, because I will talk a lot about proprioception in the rest of the course and in the practical work, it's the only sensory input that we can modify moment by moment. So I can change my proprioception, you know, just by leaning back or leaning forwards, I get an inflow of changing information. So proprioception is the thing I can change. And because I can change it, it's something I can bring my attention to and regulate.
Can I just ask about, so in certain neurological conditions, proprioception is affected, isn't it? So like in Parkinson's, possibly. And
it's indirectly affected. It's not directly affected. In things like Parkinson's and MS, Parkinson's is actually I'm sure you know, is a problem of neurotransmitters in the brain. So without which we find, you know, the messages to the muscles and the messages back from the muscles get interfered with. So proprioception, it's not that there's anything wrong with our proprioceptive nerves, there's something wrong with the production of neurotransmitters in the brain. And in multiple sclerosis, the damage to nerves is the myelin sheath gets attacked.
I'm asking it because I'm a nurse and I've definitely seen people who have issues with proprioception.
Yeah.
You know, after maybe strokes and Parkinson's.
Well, after strokes, yeah. Okay. Well, parts of the brain that receive information, the sensory motor cortex of the brain, where all our sensory maps are stored. If you have a stroke that disturbs that, then of course you lose your ability to move in the way that where those maps were interfered with. So, but that's. So you can get proprioceptive nerve damage. Multiple sclerosis, as I say, damages the myelin sheath around the nerve. Parkinson's interferes with the neurotransmitters that cause and receive movement. And, you know, motor neuron disease. I don't know if motor neuron disease interferes with proprioception. It's more muscle strength. But what we know about proprioception is that we get maps made in the brain about how our body moves, and that's through the way proprioceptive nerves send messages to a part of the brain called the sensory motor cortex, which we'll talk more about in another session. But the point about proprioception, let's just think about the point of it, is to let us know what our body is doing in space. So if you think about this, we've got three types of nerves with very specific information. Exteroception tells us, how am I in the world? You know, am I going to walk off a cliff or run into a tree? Well, I need my exteroceptors to tell me about that. I've got proprioceptors to tell me how I'm navigating my body in the world. I've got interoceptors to tell me how my body state is, whether it's has enough nutrition or not, whether I'm keeping myself alive. And I want to get to nociception. Oh, I don't know. I seem to have lost the nociception slide. Nociception is the nerve pathway that informs us if we've damaged ourselves. So it's a bit like interoception in the interoception tells us whether our body is going to die of hunger or thirst or lack of excretion or we're too tired, we need to sleep. Nociception tells us about whether our tissues have been damaged. So, you know, if I've stubbed my toe, if I cut my arm, I get messages from nociceptors telling us what's happened to my body in order to take care. If I pulled a muscle or strained a ligament, then it'll motivate me to stop using that muscle or joint. So nociception sometimes used to be called pain nerves. They don't call them pain nerves anymore because they don't inform about pain. They inform about damage to tissues, and the brain decides whether it's painful. There is no, you know, there isn't a message going up through the nerve saying this is pain. There's a message going up the nerve saying this has happened, and your brain will decide whether it's painful. So if we consider yoga to be a form of soteriology, which I do, in the modern context, we're dealing with the information we gather through our sensory nervous system, how we perceive this information, and how do we respond.
Sorry, Pete. You just used a word there that I was unfamiliar.
Soteriology. Yeah.
Can you say it again?
Soteriology.
How do you spell that?
S-O-T.
I just want to look it up. Soteriology.
S-O-T-E-R-I-O-L-O-G-Y. It means a path of liberation from suffering, a path of liberation from suffering, something like that. Different, you'll get slightly different meanings from it, but that's fundamentally what it means. And I'm talking about humanistic yoga. Humanism is very interested in flourishing. So I'm interested in how we reduce suffering, how we improve flourishing in ourselves and the world. And it's really about how we respond to information that we receive, and how we then act in the world. And what we'll notice as we go through this course is that our nervous system has two paradoxical abilities, really. One is to habituate, and one is to adapt. And we're dealing with these two things all the time, our tendency to habituate and our ability to adapt. And this course will be a lot about refining the useful habits, disrupting the unuseful ones, so that we can adapt to better habits of behaving in the world. So I am looking forward to sharing this journey with you. I really am. I enjoy these courses very much. I love hearing what you have to say about them. I love the kind of explorations that we get to. And I hope over these, it's the first time I've done one online. And I do want to make this as much I can an experience that would be a bit like we're in the room where we're talking in the tea break and meeting each other. So I'm going to exit. I'm going to stop sharing now. Come back to the room. And I'm aware that took me a bit longer than I thought. So what I think we'll do is have a tea break now. And then what I'll do is I'll put you in breakout groups to talk about what I've just said. You'll meet each other, you'll have a bit of a chat. I'll put you in groups of 6, I think. What have we got? Yeah. And then what I would like you to do, so just listen carefully to this bit. I'd like you to, when you're in a group, elect a speaker, someone who will speak for the group. And then after we come back, I'll ask one group to just say any points that came up, anything they thought about, what they thought was useful, not useful, how, whatever you thought about what I've just said. And then I'll ask you any of the other speakers to add anything if you've felt that the first speaker hadn't covered all the points. I can't go through all 6 groups, it'll just take us too long. So I'll get one group to talk, and then the other groups can just say if there's anything in their group that hasn't been said by the first group. Is that okay? Yep. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause the recording. I would really love it if, okay. Now look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into groups of 6. and magically you'll disappear into little rooms. We'll spend 20 minutes chatting to each other. It's not really very important to come to any profound conclusions. I partly want you just to get to know each other. I partly want you to, I don't know, just reflect on what I've talked about, the difference between exercise, performance, yoga, play, if you find it meaningful, or you may not, or you may just don't think it matters at all. I don't really mind. Have a conversation about it, and then I will pick a group to talk about it. And then if any of the other groups has something to add, we'll do that. Do be mindful that there's 6 of you in the group. Try and not any one person dominate the conversation, which can happen. Okay, let's see if I can do this. So I'm going to create 6 groups, and I think you'll all just float off.
You're going to press the button.
Open all rooms.
You're going to press the join button.
Create all rooms. No, join. Okay, I see. Join, 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 join. Oh. Mm. Ian, you haven't gone. What's the matter here? Oh yeah, okay. Amazing technology, isn't it? Don't seem to be able to control the speed of your return. Sorry if you got cut off halfway through a conversation. It's like half of you are stuck in cyberspace. Yeah. Hey, everyone's back. Good. Okay, I hope that was a bit worthwhile. I hope you got to speak to a few people. Catherine, can your group, would you mind if you, I don't know who's a spokesperson in your group, but.
I am, so I can, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Try to. So we made introductions and, all that. We are quite international group, all the way from the States to India, which I thought was really nice. It was a lot. So it took us a while to find something to tap into. And a lot in the way that, wow, there's like so much richness in this. And also like, woo, right. What am I going to do with all this?
Right.
But what became as a sort of overall sort of sense of it that about, that is really about this whole body experience. So that was one takeout. We then talked about why do we actually do yoga? So kind of was sort of left, or felt like we were left with that question of, well, it leaves you to ask. So what is yoga and why do we do it? And there was a lot of personal reasons in that, which circled around mental health, relaxation and self-development, which are maybe just other ways of saying how you were describing it, that, it's kind of about how we navigate and relate to the world that we live in this lifetime, because it's kind of all very much to do with that. And then really interesting, Muskan, who is joining from India, was reflecting on what's happening in the yoga world there, because everybody has this idea of, you know, in India, that's surely where you know all about yoga because that's where it comes from. But it's just really turned into exercise, fitness, how beautiful you are, and very performance orientated. Plus, there's all these people out there who are the sort of know-it-all, and you know, you kind of have to follow that or nothing. And well, that's kind of really what just happened to the practice of yoga probably everywhere, because I think that's really what we're addressing here, that kind of change that somehow happened, and maybe a misunderstanding of what the essence of the practice actually really is. And so we love your take on it, and that it's really about what you feel versus just following the supposed authority on it, but looking at what the science actually has to say, and saying, well, this is what we know now, and let's explore that and inquire into that. Maybe someone was putting it in these words, recalibrate what your ideas are about you know, what your understanding is of it so far. We noticed that, you know, looking at who's joined the course, we haven't got probably many of the sort of Instagram yogi types here. Actually, the people who want to go into the inquiry and the exploration and the felt sense of it. And I kind of ended on the note how much we appreciated how you're very eloquent on these, and the way you express yourself on this. And I just thought, oh, that's a whole other paradox in a way, because we're sort of trying to find all of these words to inquire into the body of what's actually the felt thing, and how do we put words to it.
I think that is the paradox, isn't it? We're talking about a sensory process, and we're talking about it. But there will be, of course, a lot of practice in this series. So, but we do have to find a language, and that's something I think is important. We do have to find a language, and I think the language of the felt sense isn't as good as the language of doing that most of us are familiar with. So, you know, I do think it's there's a lot to be gained from exploring language. Now, any of the other speakers from any of the group want to add anything?
I do.
Okay. Speak up. Sorry, who is that? I can't see.
This is Astrid from the Netherlands.
Astrid, hi. Yep.
Hi.
Good. Yep.
I was in a lovely group 6. And we spoke about feelings and emotions, and we concluded that this was a difficult topic. There's more questions at the moment than answers. So we're curious to hear you say more about this. And we were, I think, all motivated by your reflection on the motivation of exercise, aerobics. So it brings maybe some awareness in the game, which is nice. It gives direction, so that's a good thing. What more? I think these are the and what stood out to one of the members of the group was the power of navigating on what gives you joy.
Yeah, like that. Power. Yeah, good.
I was in that.
Okay.
I think one of the things that the question to you, Peter, was when we were talking about how it feels in your body. We were just talking about how that word kind of lands in your mind, and how you interpret what am I feeling in my body. And I wondered, we talked about maybe experience in your body, or what is happening in your body. Do those, is that all interchangeable? What you're feeling, what you're experiencing, what is happening?
I think this is one of the reasons why we get into swampy territory here, because there isn't a common language for all these things that we're interested in as yoga practitioners. And it's difficult then, because you read one book and they talk about feelings as emotions, and another book they'll talk about feelings as interoception, and some people talk about interoception globally as any feeling from in your body. Other people talk about it more specifically. So I do think we have to define terms, and we'll notice this when we get onto beliefs, you know, when we get onto the one on beliefs. The words we use mean something to us, but might mean something very different to somebody else. And one has to be very aware about that. So, you know, Catherine, what you said about the paradox of talking about a sensory process, I mean, it's almost oxymoronic, but if you don't choose your language really carefully and spend some time, you know, clarifying what you mean by words, a lot can get lost in translation. So, you know, I do think I do want to really try to help you differentiate what's a proprioceptive experience, what's an interoceptive one, what's a nociceptive one, because these all mean different things. Actually, you know, they are different nerve, but think about this for a moment. Evolution has set us up with different nerve pathways. They're not the same nerve. They're not a sort of a mash of nerves. They're bundled into different bundles, and they travel up the spine in tracts that are separated from other tracts. They arrive at parts of the brain that are different. The nerve endings are specific. So they have a task. They evolved for a purpose. So proprioception's purpose is very clearly to help me navigate my body in space, very clearly about that. That's what it does. Exteroception is very clearly about navigating me in the world, very specific. Interoception, in Damasio's terms, and this is why I want you to read Feeling and Knowing. It's not a difficult book. It's a fairly straightforward. I really encourage you to read that one, because a lot of what I'm talking about will become clearer as you read it. He's very specifically talking about interoception as the feelings that arise from internal body states. He's talking about visceral states, not arms and legs, viscera. I think there's something, you know, now I'm going out on a limb, all right? So this bit, you don't quote me too much on this, but I'm going out on a limb, because one of the things he talks about in his earlier books, When Self Comes to Mind and The Strange Order of Things, is that interoception is where the birth of self arrives, you know. And in yoga, we are kind of interested in the notion of who am I, what am I? They're quite big questions in yoga. And if you ever do this experiment in a class, and you may have done it, but you get people lying down, they're relaxing, and you ask them to put their hands on the part of their body where they feel they reside. I know that's a dualistic concept, but you know, if you ask a class to just gently put their hands on where they feel they are in their bodies, I guarantee nobody puts it on their arms and their legs. Nobody goes to their elbow. It'll be here, or it'll be here. Occasionally it's here. The odd person will go here, but then I think they've probably thought about the way they think. Now, visceroception, you know, is about what's going on in here. This is where those feelings arise. That's what Damasio is saying. He's not making a mystical point. He's making a point about how do we individuate ourselves from the rest of the world? How do I know I'm a separate being? Well, one thing is I've got a skin around me, okay, so I can see I'm physically separate. But the other is I have an individual identity. I don't merge with you. You know, when I'm standing talking, even the person I'm deeply in love with, and there are points where you feel, when you're very in the throes of love, where you feel a kind of emerging. Eric Fromm is really good on this in The Art of Loving, if you get round to reading that slim, beautiful volume. But he talks about Fromm talks about one of our problems, one of our roots of suffering is our sense of separateness. And love is our capacity to try and overcome separateness. And the falling in love is our attempt to merge with our beloved. And, I know this is almost becoming romantic as an idea, but we all struggle with this. Solitariness, being alone, is a problem. It's one of our causes of suffering. And we're interested in how we resolve suffering. I'm very interested in that. And Erich Fromm goes down the psychological route of saying love is the human's best attempt to overcome loneliness. And Damasio is saying our sense of identity arrives at feelings of interoception, which I notice. And then I also notice that my ability to relate is what quells my feelings of loneliness. So relationships, it's not the person, it's the way I relate to that person, the way that person relates to me. It's always in relationship that feelings of isolation, separateness, which is what a lot of the old yogis were talking about. How do we overcome? But they would fall back into the notion of belonging to Brahman, the universal God. That would be their approach, or fall back into universal consciousness, as Patanjali said. Don't believe you're stuck in matter. But actually, if you don't find those notions so helpful, then you have to understand, well, how do we overcome our own sense of isolation? It's one of the problems of being human, is our sense of isolation. And I think, a lot of these writers, Lisa Feldman Barrett, I find it very interesting that neuroscientists now, what I call the interesting ones, Anil Seth, Lisa Feldman Barrett, Damasio particularly, because he's just been on this journey for a long time, are interested in how we get into trouble and how we get out of trouble. They're looking at it through the nervous, the way we interact with the world. And as yoga teachers, this strikes me as just fantastic entry point. And if you understand it, if you start to understand that body states have meaning, and the meaning we give body states is historical, and some of those historical body states haven't been happy. So many of us had troubled childhoods. Many of us bring our anxieties from childhood or our previous bad experience into our everyday relationships, and they interfere with the way we interfere. They shape the way we relate. Our past shapes the way we relate. And then you find a practice that is really about how you feel in the moment. So, you're winding back. You're not talking about your emotions. You're saying, how do I feel? How do I feel in my body? What is my proprioception telling me? And when I calm myself down through my proprioception, what does my interoception say? How do I feel inside? These are things that don't have emotional labels. The feeling of weight through my hand is not an emotion, it's a feeling. And the feeling of quietening myself interoceptively, if you think about this just in a physiological sense, and I know I'm being slightly reductionist if I talk like this, but you spend a bit of time practicing a quiet yoga practice, what will be happening inside is that the hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that cause agitation and things we might put labels to get reabsorbed by the liver and broken down. Within about half an hour, 45 minutes, all those chemicals can be broken down by the liver, so they're no longer circulating. You now have a different physical state that is caused by what you've done in your yoga practice that changes how you feel. And then you try and get better at it. You try and get better at it. You try and get better at it when you're talking to your husband or your wife or your son or your dad or your mum. And you try to remind yourself, and don't let your physical state run away with you.
Can you just go over that again? Because that's like an amazing fact. I'm blown away by that. So when you calm down, when you practice, when you notice yourself and you respond, your liver is more able to absorb all the stress hormones.
No, what happened? Look, everybody lie on your back. Let's do a little bit of practice. Just lie on your back for a moment. Try and turn off any noise. Try and be in a yoga room at the moment. Try to create an environment where you're not going to be disturbed for 5 or 6 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Turn your phones off, get the lighting right, close any doors you need to close. Don't turn the computer off. Just lie on your back and bend your knees and bring your feet to the floor. First of all, just check through your body. Are there any little discomforts? You know, is your clothing wrinkled up? Is the blanket you're lying on bumpy? Can you smooth something out so that you haven't got some little part of your nervous system shouting at you saying, move me, make me more comfortable. Deal with all those things. And then deal with how your body is organized on the floor. So are your arms in a comfortable place? I don't care where you put them, just somewhere comfortable. Is your head and your neck in a comfortable place? Bring your feet to a place where you could effectively press down into the floor. Now that, we're starting to ask people to go into their bodies and find something out. So I really mean this now. I want you to bring your feet to a place that feels you can press into the whole footprint effectively. That wouldn't require much more navigation. Let your breathing settle for a moment. You may want to take a couple of slightly deeper exhalations and then let your breathing settle. Now, really bring your attention to the underside of your right foot. The whole footprint that meets the floor, your right foot. And check that you feel the footprint is equally represented on the inner, the outer, the back and the front. If it's not, rearrange where you've got your foot, bring it closer, further away, more to the midline, further away from the midline. Wherever you need to place it so that the footprint feels even. Without you having to exert effort to keep it that way. And now do the same with your left foot. Live underneath your feet. Be sure you know how you contact the floor. Again, check in with your breathing. And it's quiet and simple and uncomplicated. Now with your left foot, very, very, very lightly and gently, start to press evenly down into your footprint. So you start to feel your left hip lift. And then relax your hip back to the floor. And next time you do it, notice these things. as you press, the footprint feels deeper. The muscles in your left leg change their tonus. The feeling of weight in your left hip gets less. This is all proprioception. The weight in your right hip rolls but stays heavy. Bring the left hip back down again until your all proprioception goes back to the starting point. The muscles in your legs relax, the weight in the foot evens out, the pelvis is fully back on the floor. Do it once more. Now, as you're doing it, make sure your right foot stays steady. Not stiff, steady. Very gently start going from footprint to footprint, accurately pressing down into each footprint slowly, smoothly. The breathing is still even. And you're living on the underside of your feet, pressing into one, stabilizing the other. And you feel this gentle oscillation of the pelvis. Your jaw is relaxed. Your breathing is simple. Do your best to make the movement fluid and smooth. And then rest. Now press very gently into both feet until you feel your lumbar spine settle into the floor. And maybe just the sacrum coming off the floor. And then let the sacrum settle back onto the floor. Feel the effort in your legs evaporate. Do it once more, just far enough to get the sacrum off the floor, but the lumbar spine stays on the floor. And rest the sacrum again. And rest the body. Now arch your back very slightly so you could put your hand under the hollow of your back and feel the activity of muscles that initiate that movement in your back, in your groin, and then relax it so that all that effort dissipates. And then press both feet down again until your lower back settles into the floor. And then relax. Let the effort in the legs dissipate. And arch your back once more. Go from arching to relaxing to pressing your feet down. And a slow, smooth movement, blurring one into the other. But feel the changes in tonus of the muscles of the legs, of your back, of your tummy, as you go through these different movements. And then rest. Now ask yourself how you feel. And I suspect you feel quiet. There is something quiet in your system now. Your muscles are quiet. With a bit of luck, interoceptively, you'll feel quieter. And what have you done? You've paid attention to proprioception. You've made small movements. Why is the feeling changed? Because when our motoric output is non-aggressive, it's smooth, it's slow, it's gentle, it's attentive. The motoric output to our organs changes. We don't push out the cortisols, the adrenalines. So the internal mellow of our body changes, and then feelings change. We've changed how we feel by working gently with our body. And that's a practice. Now come into sitting. I hope that worked. I mean, feedback something. It was only a small taster, but you should have got an idea about how you quieten the mind through the body. Agree or disagree?
Yeah, that was very clear, actually. And our group was thinking along those lines, what actually happens to the mind and the body and the brain when we relax. And that was really very clear what happens, because you could feel it.
Good. Now, if you...
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So, when you were talking before we did the practice, and you were talking about noticing what we're feeling, and I think previous to that, you used a phrase "lost in translation," and there are I mean, you know me quite well, so there are things that happen in my body that I have no way to translate, to say, this is what I'm feeling. And rather than leading to some sort of clarity, looking inwards actually creates a lot of confusion for me, because often what I can't match the experience I'm having with the environment that I'm in or what I'm doing. They don't match. So I just want to share the things that sort of occurred as you were talking.
Sure.
And then another thing you were talking about was the cause of suffering being to do with the feeling of solidarity.
Not solidarity, solitude. Oh, solitude. No, actually, loneliness.
Okay. I suppose this still fits in with that, because I can relate to that and understand that. But the sense of relationship then would come from feeling maybe heard or understood. And if then that doesn't happen, then that causes greater suffering. If one finds oneself consistently having an experience where there is no feeling of relationship. And then I was just thinking about communication and how we communicate and how we know when we meet people that we form relationship with, and whether that actually comes from a knowing that's beyond the verbal knowing, you know, that people don't necessarily do the same thing, but there's something communicated through body language. Sorry, I'm kind of layering a few things on because I've jotted some notes down. That practice that we just did, that's a very familiar practice with me. And it actually doesn't the quietening for me in my body can cause anxiety. It can bring about a greater sense of anxiety. So I just wanted to share all of those things.
Sure. Right. So look, I never know. When you teach yoga, you don't know anybody's history. That's just taken as read, and I just always assume that. But I will encourage you and anybody else to see, some things are ambiguous and some things aren't. If I lie on the floor, and this is the important thing about proprioception, this is why I think we should be interested in it. So I bring my foot to the floor, and I'm looking for, see, I know I have proprioceptive nerves that are trying to inform me about where my foot is in space, whether there's too much weight on the inside or the outside. What I'm trying to do is get a clearer and clearer sense of what this message means. Now, that may seem an odd thing to say, but you could, I'm sure many of you who are teachers will have worked with people and you've said, put your feet, in the best place of pressing down, and they put their feet in really weird places, and you looked and thought, yeah, well, that's a bit odd, because they haven't learned to discriminate. And when you've had a tricky history, and many people have, it takes a long time to disentangle the labels we put on experience. So it's one of the reasons why I often start with these things, but it could be, Lynette, that you need to do some, well, actually, no, I don't want to say that. I think we have to just keep reinvestigating these things and asking ourselves as clearly as we can, what is the feeling of it? Let's lie down again. I'll just do one other thing with you. Just lie down again.
Can you define a word real quick? Right at the very end, you said motoric output.
Yeah, sorry, I did. I might use motoric output again or regularly. Motoric output is the efferent nerve from the brain, the motor nerves to both muscles and organs. So if you talk about motoric output, you're talking about not just the muscles, which is often what people say when they say the motor nerves, they mean the muscles. When we talk about motoric output, we're talking, because they don't happen individually. I don't just do the muscles or just do my organs. They're always going together. I have motor outflow from the brain to organs and muscles, happens synergically together all the time. I'm responding to the world both with my muscles and my viscera. And I will secrete hormones as well as change tonus in muscles all the time. And so when I talk about motoric output, that's what I mean. So
Can I ask, you said, does that mean that through motoric output, we produce stress hormones? Is that what you were saying, adrenaline?
If our output is anxious, yes.
Right.
So, and anxious output is based on history, what we've practiced, in a sense, unconsciously over time. What are the things that make us anxious? Well, that'll be things that from way back in history, we've recognized as worrying. Right. Feldman Barrett is very clear about the predictive nature of the brain, that all our output, moment by moment, is predicated on past practice, habit, if you like, although it's unconscious habit. And what we're trying to do in yoga is disrupt those habits when they're uncomfortable. How do we do that? We start to pay attention to what we feel proprioceptively in the moment. Nothing to do with emotions, but we feel proprioceptively. So I want to do this one other thing with you. So if you lie down again. Because often the body needs contrast. And I hope this is a bit helpful, Lynette. It may or may not be. So you lie on your back, you bend your knees, you bring your feet to the floor. as we did before, you make yourself comfortable. But if we do have habits of tension, we won't notice them. We just can't. That's the nature of a habit. So, our job in yoga is often to try and throw flour over the invisible man, to make the unconscious conscious, to make it visible to us. So I want you now to very, very gently withdraw a little bit of weight from your head, from the floor. Don't lift your head away from, don't take the head off the floor. Just take a tiny bit of the weight away from the floor and notice how the muscles in your body stiffen. Just notice that, the feeling of it. And then rest your head back down and feel it soften, feel the body soften. Do it 2 or 3 times and drop into the change of experience that you have. Don't put any labels on it, just the changing of feeling between a body that feels stiffer and then a body that feels softer. Then do it with your feet. Just withdraw a tiny bit of weight from your feet. Feel how the muscles stiffen. And then as you give your weight back to the floor, how they soften. We call this grounding. A body that is grounded is one that gives its weight to the floor and relaxes the muscles. You could lie on the floor like a statue, stiff. That wouldn't be grounding, that would be resting on the floor. A grounded body is a body that responds to the floor by softening. But sometimes we don't notice that we're still stiff. So you give it some choices. You could try it with your arm, a shoulder, your lower back, any part of your body. Just withdraw a tiny bit of weight, feel how the body changes. Then as you give the weight back to the floor, how it softens. And the feeling of change is what you're interested in. And bit by bit, over time, we get a bit better at softening, at grounding. And as we become more grounded, we start to lose history, the stiffness, the tensions, the holdings. I'm talking about months and years and decades of practice to slowly become more aware of the history we bring in our body and how we can divest ourselves of it. It's just a practice. It's the practice of yoga. Until we feel a little bit quieter. Now, there is one group of muscles that doesn't really respond to grounding, and it's the muscles of the face. So we have to take these seriously because many people talk about emotions held in muscles as well, and the muscles of the face, as we know, reliably hold expressions of emotions. So move your jaw around, slide it left and right, forwards and backwards. Do it smoothly, slowly. Lion pose. Stick your tongue out really far, open your eyes really wide. Maybe exhale fully. And then relax. Do it 2 or 3 times. So you change the state of the tonus in your muscles and your tongue, your eyes, your mouth. And then relax it again. Take a deep in-breath, fill your lungs up, and then let the tension go. Then just again, settle into both footprints. Feel your lumbar spine settle into the floor. And then relax. Now, I'm not in any way going to pretend that, suddenly from a life that's full of distress, you can become undistressed in 5 minutes. But you can, I think most of you can notice a change in feeling of your body when we practice yoga. And if all our practice, if every posture we do has this intention behind it, if every single posture we do, none of it becomes performative, none of it is about exercise. It's all about trying to do all the different movements we need in yoga with this at its heart, then we will feel different after half an hour of practice. It's almost inevitable. As long as we can keep concentrating on proprioceptive experience. Once we stop, okay, yeah. And then come into sitting. So one other thing I want to add to this, and it's important because I sometimes know that I do, and you will have practices where you're going by rote. You just lost your kind of attentiveness, and your yoga practice just happens, and that's just very human. But think about this. Another motor skill, I think Feldenkrais talks about this somewhere, and it's such a lovely analogy. It is handwriting, which is something that we probably don't do it every day anymore, but something we used to do every day and never improves. So, and I kind of, it just lands for me as something quite profound. Something you do every day, it never gets any better. It stays absolutely the same. And that's what most of our lives are like, actually, if we're not careful. When handwriting changes is when you decide to do calligraphy, when you start paying attention to the way you make the brushstrokes, where you don't just write, you pay attention to how you're writing. Then your handwriting changes, and it changes over the long term. It doesn't just change for a day. Once your handwriting is improved, once you've paid attention, once you've learned how to pay attention, your handwriting improves. Now, yoga practice is the calligraphy of the body. We're trying to practice how to organize ourselves in the world that feels more comfortable. And we want to notice the things we do that feel uncomfortable. And then we want to notice, what did we do? What was our motoric output at the time it changed? What did I do? Then you start that process of slowly permeating your feelings and giving yourself a chance to do it differently. That's what we're interested in. But it is a slow, well, I don't even know if it's a slow process. Sometimes it's quite quick. But it is a process, and it's ongoing, and change. I sometimes realize, I sometimes think, or, I keep a journal. And if I look back at my journal 10 years ago, I can see that I was quite a different person 10 years ago than I am now. My concerns were different. I think there were worries I had then. It could just be me getting older. I don't know. You never know how much of this is practice and how much of this is aging. But I think what you notice with habits, like handwriting, that if you don't disrupt them, you become more the same. If you disrupt them, you have a chance of change. And that's what we're interested in, disrupting habits that are uncomfortable so that we have a chance to change and form habits that are more comfortable. And they're nearly always about the way we relate to the world and our partners and our friends and our family and our community and the earth and the universe and whatever else you want to include in that. But it starts with noticing what we feel. That's where it starts. What do I notice? How did I respond? And how did that make me feel? And in yoga, we're trying to intervene with that practice. You want to respond to that? I don't know, Lynette, did that help at all?
I feel like I've said enough actually already. I suppose it's I don't disagree with what you're saying. On an experiential level, for me, it creates agitation. So I'm feeling agitated by it, but I anticipated that I would, because I've done a lot of work with you already. And I know what you're going to say now, because the anticipation was there. I don't think
I wasn't going to say that.
Oh, okay, but I don't think I anticipate. I've been really looking forward to starting this, and I've been really wanting to do more work with you. But the distance has always created the problem. So to do it like this is much more palatable. And there hasn't been a sense of agitation. I hadn't thought about it until you started talking, and then I recognised that feeling coming up, and I start to question it in myself. What's happening? Why is that happening? And then that creates more agitation for me.
Sure. Once we start thinking, one of the questions I would ask you is, what are the situations when you feel least agitated? You know, that'd be something I'd become interested in. What are the situations you find yourself? I mean, I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, but that would be the kind of question that would come up if I was talking one-to-one. And what are the differences between that situation and the ones where you do feel agitated? So, you know, you could think around that. Okay. Any other? Before we move on. Graham, I can see you're unmuted.
What I was going to ask is this different then from any other form of distraction? Does
distraction
the bond the same way if I pick up a guitar, or if I practice yoga, or if I go for a walk? I suppose obviously there's going to be some physiological differences, but in principle, what I'm doing is taking my mind.
Okay, well, there's similar physiological changes. So you're right. You know, walking in nature is reliably calming for most people. Playing a musical instrument, anything they want, enjoy. The difference between a yoga practice and those kind of things is our intention when we practice yoga is to notice the things that cause us discomfort. So we've got a particular purpose when we're doing yoga. To notice when things change. What's nice about, or what's easy about yoga in a sense, is that first of all, we're often talking about the body. So you say to someone, they're sitting there on their heels, and you suddenly notice they're grimacing, you know, and you say, why are you grimacing? I say, well, my feet hurt. And then you can say, well, why don't you do something about it? You know, I'm being a bit flip here, but you notice discomfort and then you address it. And as we go through our practice, and we'll get a bit more done in a minute. We'll notice both physical and psychological resistances to certain things. And then I'll encourage you to say, well, what is it? You know, the good thing about yoga is you can always start in a comfortable place. Let's do this one. Let's all sit on our heels.
Pete, can I just say something about distraction? Because I thought what Graham said then was really interesting, because I think for me, my experience of this way of practicing is that it's not about distraction. Like in the past, when I've had difficult days at work and I've gone to the gym and listened to really loud music on my earphones and exercised intensely, trying to block out all my stresses and anxieties. So that's my distraction. But with this practice, I sit with myself.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. This comes back
sit with myself.
Well, you know, this all gets rather
Not
profound.
in a bad way.
No. But if you think about it, when you talk about yourself in the way you just did, you really talked about your thoughts.
Yeah, I just mean me as a person, and whatever defines me and whatever my experience of me is at that time, whether it's a physical experience, a mental experience, a stressful experience. It's that I notice.
Okay. And in our yoga practice, what we're trying to do almost is get rid of thoughts. We're trying to find a way to quieten ourselves down, not in an avoidance sort of way, but to notice how we can come back through the turmoil of life, and all the thoughts and ruminations that we have, the emotions that they bring up. We come back to the senses of the body. We start working with the body quieter because we're dropping into sensory experience. Our thoughts quieten down, our interoception changes. We start to feel different. And if we can do this more regularly, we're going to escalate into emotional turmoil less often. And our yoga practice is the practice of how to become still in a tumultuous world. And then slowly, how do I take that stillness into a tumultuous world without it constantly knocking me off my feet? And I really don't mean in a kind of a monk-like disconnection from the world. I mean by being completely involved in how you feel and knowing what those feelings mean.
Yeah, so for me, it's not about a distraction anymore.
It's about immersing yourself in yourself.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Let's try immersing ourselves in this. Sit on your heels for a moment and bring your hands to either side of your knees. Now, the important thing when you're doing yoga practice like this is to constantly check in and ask yourself, do you feel okay? I sometimes use the analogy, and I quite like the analogy. I'm sure I'll use it hundreds of times in this course. I think of a yoga posture, I think about it like running a film. And what I'm doing moment by moment is moving through each frame of the film. And I want to make sure that in every frame of the film, I feel comfortable and I feel okay. My breathing's all right. My muscle tone is all right. I feel stable. So I'm sitting on my heels. I've got my hands on the floor, and then I'm going to rest my head on the floor. I'll just show you what we're going to do. You're going to rest your head on the floor. You're going to keep your hands competently in contact with the floor. You're going to check you feel all right. You're going to keep those conditions, and then you're going to roll slowly onto the crown of your head. And you're going to ask yourself, how do you feel then? Does that feel okay? And then you're going to roll back again. And I want you to do that several times and just see if you can keep a feeling of okayness through the whole movement. That's what I want you to see. So you want the movement to be smooth. You want to pay attention to things like the contact with your hands on the floor, that it doesn't change. You want to feel your head roll smoothly. You can ask yourself the question, is my head comfortable on the floor? You may want to put a mat underneath it, a folded blanket if you feel the discomfort. And then after your next one, come back into sitting on your heels. Sorry, Alison, you chatted, you'd like to hear more about calm motoric output leading to calm feelings. If I set my intention to steady myself, to quieten myself, and to lean onto my hands, to rest my head gently, to check my breathing. So the output to my muscles is quiet, is steady, is under control. The output to my organs will have a similar cadence, a similar tempo. If I start stomping around, trying to do things, being busy in a kind of agitated, fast way, I'll be secreting hormones that match the tempo of my muscles. So if I want to change the internal milieu, I have to set an intention of quietness. It's the only thing I can control. Let's put it this way. I can control my breathing to some extent, but I can control my muscular movements. And I can't control voluntarily the secretions to my organs. I can't do that. That's an autonomic process. But the autonomic processes echo what I do with my body. So if I'm addressing my body in a way where my intention is to go through this with everything about it being about stability, ease, quietness in my breathing, comfort, steadiness, and maybe we're going to do this. Well, all I'm interested in isn't the performance, and that's what I really want to land. I'm not interested in the performance at all, at all, at all. I'm interested in, can you maintain the quality of experience throughout the movement? And if you can't, can you notice when it changes? Because that's the important thing. When does the feeling change from feeling quiet, confident, stable, and okay to something that feels different? So just go through that simple movement where you add straightening your legs. So it's never about, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? It's about noticing change. If you get into trouble early on, stop early on. If you were, we're not going to do it today, but if you were to progress, if you're going to bring knees onto arms, if you're going to take knees away from arms, the danger there is we get performative, we start trying to do it. But I would always encourage you, however far you're going in any posture, the aim of it is to notice any time you move away from a centered state of being into something performative where you're just trying to do something. Then you've shifted into performance mode or maybe exercise mode. And then we're doing something different. Now, and then come back onto all fours. So a lot of what we're learning to do is inquire into sensory experience and what it means to us. So those of you who come to my classes regularly will be familiar with this, but some of you won't be. When you come onto all fours and you're looking for support through your arms and your legs, the quality of support is important, is significant. So I could lock my elbows out and press down into the floor and push my body away. That creates a certain feeling in my body, a stiffening of the tissues. and a kind of brittleness of support. Or I could bend my elbows and the insides of my hands would uproot and I would sink down between my shoulders a bit. And I feel a little less supported, under supported maybe. So I can stiffen into over support. I can collapse into under support, which means I can also look for a support that is neither of those two extremes. The support that makes me feel steady, quiet. So my elbows aren't buckling, but they're not locking. My handprints meet the floor broadly, but not stiffly. I'm not pushing through my shoulders, and I'm not collapsing. And I'm looking for an experience of steady, reliable support. And then my breathing feels okay. Now I turn my toes under. And you take your weight back over your heels. Now, if you, at this point, really rest your pelvis onto your heels, your pelvis will ground onto your heels. You become grounded. And what you will feel is a change in tonus of the muscles of your lower trunk, your abdominal muscles, your lower back muscles, they'll relax. If you're not sure about that, lift your pelvis a tiny bit away from your heels and feel the muscles engage again. Drop the pelvis back onto your heels fully, give your weight to your heels, feel the muscles relax. Now, take your knees about a centimeter off the floor and feel the change in tonus of your muscles. Put the knees back on the floor, feel the muscles relax again. Do that 2 or 3 times. See if you can distinguish the difference between the feeling that your handprints deepen and you lean into your hands more when your knees come off the floor. See if you can distinguish that feeling from pushing. So do it 3 or 4 times. Just bring your knees a little bit off the floor and then down again. And you feel a change in tonus of your muscles. But that doesn't have to be anything to do with pushing, even though the feeling may feel close to pushing. Pushing will be doing more. Okay, and then sit on your heels. I'll explain this a little bit more. So when I'm here, I'm supported on 6 bones, my hands, my knees, and my toes. 6 lots of bones, my body weight distributed between all 6 points. If I take my knees off the floor, my body weight will be distributed on 4 points. So they will feel, my handprints will deepen, my toes will stretch more. And the muscles of my trunk will have to do the work my knees were doing. So I'll feel an increase in tone in my muscles. This is just maintaining useful support. I've removed support from my knees, and now the muscles have to support me. So I feel a change in the tonus of the muscles. That's one thing. If this happens, I've gone a bit fuzzy. What sometimes happens is we muddle that feeling with pushing. We're doing something extra. If I just lift my knees off the floor, all I'm doing is transferring the support from my knees to my arms. I'm not moving. I'm not changing. There's no movement change in my trunk. But if you can't discriminate between pushing and support, when you take your knees off the floor, you'll find yourself pushing yourself back, adding something that doesn't need to be added. Pushing is doing something when your knees come off the floor. But if you just bring your knees off the floor, all that happens is your muscles change their tonus to maintain your support. And that's what I want you to discriminate, the difference between pushing and supporting. Have a go. All you want to do is maintain support. That's all I'm asking you to do, nothing else. This is a discrimination of a sense of effort in your muscles. What are my muscles doing? And then try this. If you manage to make that discrimination, if you think you now can take your knees off the floor without adding anything, just the muscles of support, can you keep your arms simply doing that job of supporting, nothing else, not adding anything as you unfold your legs? Now, some of you won't be able to straighten your legs. I don't mind. You might just want to get to here. That's fine. But you're trying, your interest is in your ability to stay competently supported through your arms while your legs do something else. That you don't start adding work with your arms that is unnecessary. You're trying to make that discrimination now. Can you straighten your legs and stay quiet through your arms? And then come into child pose for a moment. Grounding, giving our weight to the floor through our bones and feeling our muscles relax, is I think it's the only tool we have to undo unconscious patterns of holding in our muscles, apart from drugs, which we're not going to use. So we have to take this seriously if we're interested in the process of reducing unconscious behavior in our body. And these postures that we're doing now, downward dog, tripod base, head balance, are about grounding through the arms. So what I'm trying to do, what I'm interested in, is the quietening of my body by committing my weight to the floor through my arms and not getting busy in them, other than the necessary effort to keep me stable, supported, secure. So I'm looking for a security through my arms as I go into dog. Now, there are 3 postures like this. We'll do them all. Elbow dog is another one. But the intention is exactly the same. I'm trying to quieten myself through my elbows. For me and for many people, the effort is a little bit greater. So the challenge of discrimination between just supporting myself through my elbows and becoming busy and tense is a little bit harder. I have to work a little bit harder at making sure that I don't start pushing, that I just keep my body supported. I don't want to get tense in my jaw. I don't want to get tense in my neck. So do that a few times. And again, you're interested in this feeling of quiet. You're not interested in the performance. And then sit back on your heels. And the final one of these is the head balance base, where you bring the head to the floor. And again, you're thinking about these in terms of becoming quiet through grounding, through your arms, through your head. And I'd encourage you to think of your head like another elbow, just to rest the head on the floor. So you've got the elbows and the head taking your weight. And you come onto your tiptoes. But there's nothing, your interest, your ability to stay quiet, to stay stable, to feel unruffled once you've established a quiet base by the straightening of your legs. This shouldn't cause any ripples, any disturbance in your feeling. That's what we're aiming for. Your practice is aiming to straighten your legs without a disturbance of feeling. Often these kind of movements bring up worries and concerns for people that are about thoughts rather than feelings. Okay, and then rest. Has the sound changed or is it still okay? Thumb up if it's okay. Okay. I just had a funny noise in my earpiece. I wondered if it had died.
Pete, I noticed there's an anticipatory clench of my tummy as I go through the floor.
Yeah, fantastic. I think, you exactly make the point that we anticipate so much.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to practice, not anticipating, just to notice what's going on. So
it got better.
Yeah.
Once I noticed that's what I was doing, I thought, can I do it without doing that?
Yes, that's exactly the right answer. So you notice anticipation, that's what happens. We practice, we notice a disturbance. What you noticed was this anticipatory clenching. And then the reason we repeat stuff is in order to say, well, next time, can I do it without that? And you try it a few times until you can do it free of your anticipation. And all you're doing is practicing on feeling quiet.
Okay,
And then, your kind of handwriting has improved as soon as you've done that.
And is it almost like that, doing 100 lines of your handwriting?
Well, if you
noticing the busyness, because I think I just noticed maybe tension, maybe busyness as I rolled from one sort of place to another.
Yeah.
I couldn't kind of get, in order to get into down dog, I had to go past a bit of busyness, and I didn't know how to quieten at that point. But I guess maybe it's just practice, is then just noticing.
Yeah. So you're doing a calligraphy and you can't make a perfect circle, and you notice that you can't make a perfect circle. It improves over time. You know, next week you'll do a better circle than you did last week, and in a year's time it'll be better than that. So your discrimination just improves if that's what you're practicing. And then, you know, I do want to keep on pointing out that we're at the moment, what we're practicing is discrimination of proprioceptive feelings in our body. And that's, I think, a fantastic way to start in yoga, because it's non-confrontational. It doesn't really create much defensiveness in people if you ask them to notice muscle stiffening or softening, or whether they're pushing or supporting. But it is very interesting in life if you start to notice in conversations with someone, or you know, if the conversation is getting a little warm, feelings of defensiveness, or feelings of hostility, or feelings of fear that come up, and then again, your interest is to notice what it was that happened as those feelings changed. So you noticed on the journey towards a head balance, at some point your feelings of anticipation came in. With practice, you learn how to go towards head balance without the feeling of anticipation, or you know, maybe you will be able to. And in life, we're trying to notice changes in feeling that aren't helpful. I'm trying to pick my words carefully here. I really want to differentiate here feelings that are appropriate. So, you know, it's quite appropriate if some yoga teacher comes on and leans on you and makes your back hurt or your legs hurt, you know, for your legs to go ouch and you to tell the teacher to get off. That's an appropriate response to a strong proprioceptive feeling. If something happens in your life that is upsetting, you know, someone close to you is ill, or and you're upset, or dies, and you suffer grief, these are appropriate responses. We're not trying to get rid of them. These are absolutely appropriate. What we're trying to notice is the unhelpful feelings, the ones that come in that don't help us. They just interfere with the smooth unfolding of life. They get in the way. Appropriate responses are there to help us heal. You know, if I break my arm and it hurts, it's there to stop me moving my arm so that the bones can heal. If I have a feeling of grief because someone I love has died, I need time to process the vacuum that's been left by the person who you love. And that takes time, and it needs all the kind of conversations, the feelings of being on your own. You know, it needs those feelings to enable you to get on with life eventually. Without that person, you have to go through a process. But there are some things that just get in the way. We always feel fearful in the confrontation. We fly off the handle all the time. We burst into tears every time someone shouts at us. These things aren't helpful. These get in the way. And these are the habits we're trying to disrupt. We're trying to notice when they come up and say, well, what happened there? You know, why did I start to feel uncomfortable? Is there another way I can approach this? Or do I need to bring that feeling in? That's what we're interested in. We're starting off with practicing with feelings in the body. But all feelings have a purpose. They really do. I'm not talking about life having a purpose. Feelings have a purpose. They evolved over millennia for a reason. And Damasio goes on in his books to argue that emotional feelings serve a purpose in social situations. We have them in order to regulate our social environment. You know, we feel love, we feel anger, we feel joy when we're with people for reasons of behavior, how people behave. Some things make us angry, some things make us happy, some things make us sad. And that's all appropriate if people behave well or badly towards us. These are homeostatic feelings. That's how Damasio talks about them, ones that regulate us. And then there are the habits, just like habits of tension in my muscles that aren't helpful, or the habits of anger that just fly off the handle every time someone criticizes me. You know, they're just baked in an unconscious way from our past, and they're disruptive. And they're the ones that we're trying to spot. They're the ones we're trying to throw flour over. They're the ones we're trying to slowly dispel. We're nearly up to time. Are there any things anyone wants to say? We've got 5 more minutes. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing next time, the mirological fallacy. It'll be more practical. We'll have much more practice in the next one. This one's been, I realize this has been a bit word heavy, but the opening ones always are because I'm trying to set the scene. So we'll have more experiential work next time. The mirological fallacy is something I came across as an idea. I could have completely rephrased it. There are other words I could have used, but it caught my imagination. And it's the way parts relate to the whole. And I was listening to a neurologist talking to a philosopher on the radio. This was about 15 years ago. He was a very old philosopher, he's about 80 years old, a guy called Rom Harris. And the neuroscientist he was talking to said something like, the lateral cingulate of the brain is where we recognize faces. And the philosopher said to him, "You've just fallen into the mirological fallacy." And I thought, my ears pricked up. I thought, oh, really? What's that? The neuroscientist said, "What's that?" And I said, "What's that?" in my mind. And he said, the lateral cingulate of the brain is just a part of the brain. It can't remember faces. To remember faces, you need a whole human being with a memory, a story, other parts of the brain, a muscular system, a heart that beats, blood that circulates. He said the lateral cingulate can't do that. It may light up when you look at a face, but it only lights up because it's involved in the process of seeing a face. And I think in yoga, we have all this stuff about, we'll talk about it more next time. I read a whole article on the psoas muscle, the soul muscle, the muscle that is our soul. And I thought, what a load of bollocks, because it's this kind of taking parts of us out and elevating them that I really object to. So we're going to spend the next session really looking at how not to do that and how to increasingly think about whole human beings engaged in the world, not bits of human beings engaged in the world. And you get this with pain as an osteopath. Someone comes in with knee pain, and if you're not careful, you start treating a knee instead of a person. And it's a big mistake because quite a lot of knee problems aren't really about the knee. A lot of back problems aren't about the back. There's a whole story usually wrapped up, unless you've just fallen off a horse, and hurt yourself. I mean, that's slightly different. But things that occur over time usually have a context in which they're embedded, and we have to understand that. So next time we'll be talking about that more, and I'll try and warn you off from.
I guess that's how modern medicine works, isn't it? I've been reading about that. About it's just a disease. It's this part of the body. It's that part of the body. We in modern medicine, we very rarely see the body as a whole.
You're absolutely right. Are you a nurse?
Yeah, with the nurses on here. The nurses and the yoga teachers who are like, why have I been? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think we've fallen into thinking about people a bit like machines, and neurology works very well on machines. We're thinking mechanistically about biological structures. That's fundamentally the mistake. In biological structures, you have to think about systems. In machines, by all means, think about parts. You know, my car doesn't really care if it's hot or cold, if it's light or dark, but I do.
It's a system within a system as well, though, isn't it? We're a biological system within a other system, within the whole context of where we are.
Never stops.
It's never ending.
Okay. Well, it's 8 o'clock, and I'm sure you all want supper. Or some of you might want tea because you're in America, or coffee, probably. Anyway, I will thank you all for coming along and being such kind participants. And, I've very enjoyed being here.
Thank you.
And I will see you next month.
Thanks, Pete.
Do email me, contact me whenever you like. The whole point about running this course is I want to be accessible at the other end of an email. This is all I'm doing at the moment, so feel free.
Can you just share the name of the book that because I don't know how you spell his name, the Knowing and Feeling Man,